Why do we all love Derrick Rose? Let's get into this. Quickly before we get the video started, if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more NBA content just like this one, hit that subscribe button and that post notification bell. Anyways, back to the video. Derrick Rose was drafted number 1 overall in the 2008 NBA draft, and ever since he got to the NBA, he's been an absolute stud. He became the NBA's youngest player to ever win the MVP award, and ever since then, he was just beloved by NBA fans and NBA players around the league. Whenever you hear somebody talk about D Rose now, I think most NBA fans know this guy, just love this guy just for what he is, but I don't think necessarily a lot of NBA fans necessarily know how good D Rose was back in his prime. He was absolutely fantastic. Of course, before D Rose was actually drafted number 1 overall to the Chicago Bulls, the Bulls are in a little bit of a drought, and ever since D Rose got there, he completely elevated that team and took them to the heights they were actually eventually able to get to. Of course, when you look back at that Chicago Bulls team, you definitely do see a very talented roster. They had players like Jimmy Butler, of course before he blew up and really became the player he is now, but still at the time he was a decent player. They had guys like Joakim Noah, who was good back then. They had guys like Taj Gibson, who was good back then, Luol Deng, who was good back then. They had a really talented roster, but of course nothing was possible if they didn't have that MVP level Derrick Rose on the roster. He was really the guy that elevated that team to the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference with the Miami Heat, with that big 3 in that Eastern Conference at the time as well. They were just a very good team and definitely got to some crazy heights. But let's quickly take D Rose's game point by point when he was in his prime to really see how special this guy truly was. Now, I personally think the first thing that people think of when they hear of prime D Rose is just pure athleticism. D Rose was one of the most athletic guys we had in the NBA at that time, and maybe one of the most athletic guys we have in the NBA of all time. He was just crazy athletic, and we saw so with his crazy posterizing dunks. So let's first start off with his bread and butter, which is his driving and finishing ability. Of course, as I just mentioned, when D Rose gets all the way to the basket, a lot of the times in his prime, he would actually dunk over the taller defender, and if he gets all the way to the basket, he was basically no match and basically unstoppable when he got to that point. But the great thing about D Rose is he wasn't only using his athleticism to dunk over people. He was actually very talented in terms of his finishing ability, in terms of actually making layups and being very creative in the air and using his athleticism that way, and not just trying to dunk over people every single time, because of course that doesn't work every time. But D Rose still has this ability today, but he's able to really hang in the air a very long time and just finish over taller defenders with very crafty layups, and that was, in my opinion, personally the biggest reason why he was such a great finisher when he got to the basket. Of course, there are a ton of players in the NBA, this is the highest level, that are incredibly athletic and have the ability to dunk over defenders from time to time. But the thing about D Rose and what made him so effective is, obviously, as I mentioned, he had that layup game, very crafty layup game I should mention, to add with his crazy athleticism and the ability to dunk over you. So that's why, in my opinion, I think he was so effective when getting all the way to the basket and basically unstoppable. But D Rose wasn't a guy who was only able to get to the basket. He had some other skills that really helped him out as well, and one of his other biggest strengths besides his finishing ability was his mid-range shooting ability. Now, I also wanted to quickly put in here, D Rose had an amazing floater to his game, and the floater helps him pretty significantly as well, especially when he was so effective at getting to the basket, because now when D Rose is going downhill and the defender is expecting him to get all the way to the basket, sometimes they kind of back off to get into a better position to defend the actual layup or dunk. When the defender does that, now D Rose can easily pull up from that mid-range shot or even put up that floater that I mentioned that he's pretty effective at, and that's just another shot that's wide open for him and just makes him that much more effective. And now the next time he goes down the court, now the defender really has to respect that floater game and that mid-range game and play him a little bit higher, and now he's able to get all the way to the basket for an easy dunk or layup. It just makes him that much more dynamic. But specifically talking about D Rose's mid-range jump shot, this is definitely something he worked on tremendously ever since getting to the NBA and really perfected it ever since he got into his prime. D Rose was especially effective at that pull-up mid-range jump shot, which in general is a very effective shot, but when you talk about D Rose's ability to get all the way to the basket and be so effective at it, that just makes his mid-range jump shot that much more effective. And then when defenders obviously are respecting his mid-range shot, then he can get all the way to the basket that much easier. When you're good at multiple things on the offensive side of the ball, it really just opens everything up and makes your life that much easier. And when you looked at D Rose, he had so many different things he was good at, which just made him such a great player in his prime. Moving on to D Rose's three-point jump shot, this is definitely something that he really did have to work on ever since he got into the NBA, and even in his prime, he got better at it from earlier on in his career, but it was still definitely not a strength of his and one of his weaknesses on the offensive side of the ball. D Rose definitely had the confidence to take his three-point shot, but he definitely wasn't making it at a very very high clip, and he really relied on either his mid-range shot or just his ability to get all the way to the basket and dunk over people or finish around people getting to the basket. But also keep in mind, when D-Rose was in his prime, this was a while ago, it was 2008, 2009, 2010, those seasons, and actually having a three-point jump shot and being very effective at that three-point jump shot at that point guard position was far less important than it is now to this day. On the defensive side of the ball, D-Rose definitely wasn't known for his defensive ability, but the good thing for D-Rose is, first of all, he was coached by head coach Tom Thibodeau, which is obviously known to be a great defensive coach, but he had so many different great defenders on his team as well, like Jimmy Butler, Luol Deng, Taj Gibson, Joakim Noah, so it didn't matter as much that D-Rose wasn't a great defender on the team, because overall the Bulls as a team were a great defensive team, and you could always hide that one player on your defense. But besides being such a great player in his prime, why do NBA fans and NBA players around the league love D-Rose so much? We all know the reason why D-Rose's prime was cut so short, and that was due to an ACL injury. And of course, after that ACL injury, when he came back, he had an Achilles injury, and then the injuries really started to pile onto him. D-Rose was at a point in his career where he would just get a pretty significant injury, work very hard during that offseason in order to get back the next season, and the next season that he comes back, he got another really significant injury, and he was just kind of in that cycle of just working tremendously hard to get back, then getting injured again, and just keep going in that same cycle, and obviously something needed to give. Now, after an ACL injury, an Achilles injury, some smaller injuries that D-Rose had to go through, a lot of players, NBA players that were in the position that D-Rose was in, probably would have given up by that point. Here was a guy who was already in his prime, was getting a ton of money in terms of his Adidas contract deal, in terms of his actual contract, in terms of all the things he had overseas that he was getting paid for. D-Rose was obviously getting a ton of money. So a lot of NBA players in his position might say, let me just retire at this point, I'm getting injured too much, I already have a ton of money, I'm good going forward in terms of my finances. But D-Rose was completely different. He continued to work extremely hard to continue to come back each and every season and really work on himself, and D-Rose finally realized that he kind of needed to change his game in order to come back and not to get injured as much as he did. And that's the biggest change. D-Rose finally had that inflection point that he needed to change his game, and now that's the difference between the D-Rose we saw in his prime and the D-Rose we see now, and the reason why he's able to play now injury-free, knock on wood, for a pretty significant amount of time at this point. The change that D-Rose made is when he was always getting to the basket, he was jumping as high as he could, and he was landing on one leg. And of course, as we all know, that's very, very dangerous, and that's the biggest reason, and probably the main reason, why D-Rose was struggling with all these injuries. It was the way he was landing. So during the offseason, one of the off seasons, he really worked on how to change his landing ability and actually land properly on 2 feet to really protect himself going forward, and also not completely jump as high as he can every time he gets to the basket, and that's a change that we've definitely seen. And watching his game now, he's more predicated on his three-point and mid-range shooting ability, and also getting to the basket at times, but he doesn't necessarily try to jump as high as he can once he gets to the basket. And now he, instead of really relying on his athleticism and trying to dunk over people, he kind of relies on his athleticism in terms of actually trying to finish around the basket with those crafty layups, as I mentioned before. So that really comes in handy, and he's kind of a completely new player now than he was before, and this new style of game that he has now is more sustainable long term, and I think we've seen that throughout the past few seasons. But besides just being an amazing player, that's the reason why I personally think that D-Rose is so beloved. He could have just quit. He went down with a tremendous amount of injuries. He already had a ton of money at that point, but he actually decided, instead of giving up, he decided to really put the time and work in and really try to change his game in order to be a more effective player in the NBA at that point and continue to play in the NBA, because that's what he did and that's what he loved. And that hard work and dedication that D-Rose really put in is the big reason, in my opinion, why D-Rose is one of the most beloved players in the NBA, maybe the most beloved player. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Why, in your opinion, do you think D-Rose is so beloved in the NBA by fans and players? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.